politics, these ideas affect both political parties. And here I'll just mention the two most prominent figures. Theodore Roosevelt, Republican, who's a vice president, became president after McKinley, served for a term, decided later he wanted to serve again. I'll come back to that at the end. And the other figure, in many ways the key figure of the early progressive movement, is Woodrow Wilson, an academic, the president of Princeton, who then runs for president in 1912 and is elected. I want to read something that he gave as a stump speech of his campaign in 1912. Some citizens of this country, he wrote, have never got beyond the Declaration of Independence. That document did not mention the questions of the day, he wrote, and is of no consequence to us unless it can be turned into a program of government action. Consider how he describes this new idea of government. Government is not a machine, but a living thing. It falls not under the theory of the universe, but under the theory of organic life. It is accountable to Darwin, not to Newton. It is modified by its environment, necessitated by its tasks, shaped by its functions, by the sheer pressure of life. No living thing can have its organs offset against each other as checks and live. On the contrary, its life is dependent upon their quick cooperation, their ready response to the commands of instinct and intelligence, their amicable community of purpose. There can be no successful government without the intimate, instinctive coordination of the organs of life and action. This is not a theory but fact, and displays its force as fact, whatever theories may be thrown across its track. Living political constitutions must be Darwinian in structure and in practice. Society is a living organism and must obey the laws of life, not of mechanics. It must develop. All that progressives ask or desire, this is still Wilson, is permission. In an era when development, evolution, is the scientific word to interpret the Constitution according to the Darwinian principle. All they ask is recognition of the fact that a nation is a living thing and not a machine. So, in those passages from his speech in 1912, called What is Progress? It's very circulated out there. You can get it on the internet. You can see all the terms I've referred to, all the language I referred to in that statement. Science, Darwin, change, the idea of getting away from established beliefs. And behind that, this argument that government must develop consistent with an evolutionary theory. It must grow and change in order to keep up with the times. It must be understood as a living organism. So in the minds of these new thinkers, this refounding, if you will, marked the end of the old order and the birth of what they called the New Republic. What I want to do on the board is lay out some contrast between the older view and the progressive view, and I think by laying them out against each other, we'll see more clearly what I mean by that. So on the left side here, I've laid out some of the general principles of American constitutionalism, and I want to explain those and then lay out what the progressives meant by the same ideas. You can see that keen difference. We can begin with the idea of nature or order, and I have equal rights and liberty. These three concepts you can associate initially with the Declaration of Independence if you have that document in your mind. But for the American founders, there was such a thing as a nature, a human nature, but also a natural order of things, which led many of them to see and understand a certain concept of the natural law. There was a permanent order that gave them mooring for all the other things they believed. It's in the Declaration of Independence that nature, or what they call the laws of nature and nature's God, give rise to concepts of equal rights with which we are endowed by our Creator. And we have those rights equally because we are equal in our nature. That idea of equality, which is a starting point, a philosophical starting point, leads to a concept of liberty, of freedom. Here I point out that the Americans used the word liberty, which is an old Latin word. Freedom, it's going to turn out, is actually a Germanic word. But they preferred liberty because liberty implies a certain liberty appropriate for humans, appropriate to their nature. These concepts of the Declaration give rise to certain concepts in the Constitution. Out of the Declaration, we get the idea of consent and certain ways of how government should be structured. The purpose of government, according to the American founding, is to be limited. Limited because the rights grounded in nature are possessed by the people, individuals. Only because they delegate certain of those rights to government do we need a structure called a Constitution, which has a certain set of those, how those powers are going to be divided into certain departments, setting up things like checks and balances, the separation of power, a structure which creates that kind of limitation on government which allows a flourishing of our freedom. That in turn has a certain implication for society. The objective of American constitution, I would suggest, is self-government. That is, you keep government limited so we can flourish in our lives to pursue our happiness. Now let's consider what the progressives thought of those ideas and how it transfers over to them. The first one on terms of nature and order. We've already talked a little bit about Charles Darwin. For the progressives, this idea of nature, and hence the order of the universe, is very changeable, and to use his word, it evolves. There is no fixed nature in man. There's also no fixed nature in the order of things around it. Everything is changing. That means if there's no fixed nature out of which arise rights, this concept of rights for the progressives is also changing. Indeed, it's evolving, and it's to be secured by government, but also defined by government, by the state. Our rights, you might recall, are fundamental, unalienable, because they are fundamentally associated with our very nature, say our religious liberty. Not so for the progressives. The concept of liberty as well becomes, for the progressives, something that's what they called positive. They thought the American founders merely meant by liberty a formal liberty, what you can't do. For the progressives, they wanted it to be positive, what can be done, what can be fulfilled, what can be created. When it comes to government, the whole operations of American constitutionalism, all of its limits, all of its structure, all of that for the progressives is a barrier. It's in the way. It's a barrier to progress. Recall the use of their term, living constitution. For the progressives, the objective of government is to be unlimited. By its very nature, it must be unlimited. It's a tool for what? For progress. And all of these concepts are to be replaced by something else, which they called the administrative state. Whoops. Very important concept. The whole structure of government, of its limits, of federalism, of checks and balances, of the separation of power, all of this is to be replaced by this new form of government, which they called administrative. That administrative idea is made up of experts and planning. Recall, when you look ahead in future discussions, Hayek's concept of the fatal conceit, the conceit that you can plan things in government. And of course, it's all going to be highly centralized. So you've lost a mooring in nature, which means everything changes and evolves. New rights are to be secured because they're defined by the state, and freedom is no longer the freedom from government in order to be protected in practicing and pursuing your happiness, but a positive concept that's to be created. Who's going to do that creation? Who's going to secure and define these rights? Who's going to keep track of what changes and evolves? But government. And since everything changes and evolves and grows and expands, Government, by definition, must be unlimited in order to pursue and achieve more and more progress. And the process by which you're going to do that is to create this new idea called the administrative state. Think in modern terms of bureaucrats and experts running things, planning things from centralized offices in Washington. And their objective, as opposed to being self-government in a free society, their idea is a national community. That is, this idea that things are done with and only through the state, through government. Government itself, the administrative state, which is unlimited, which secures and defines rights in a changing and evolving world, this concept of government is what is the end. And so the national community, that is our participation in state activities, in government, is what is the main objective. It's the collective, the sense of social justice, as opposed to self-government. The progressives thought about all these ideas, and they intentionally meant these ideas to offset these ideas. That was their objective, and that's what they laid out to do, to fundamentally deny the philosophical groundings of the Americans, but also fundamentally restructure and retransfigure the whole notion of limited government into unlimited administrative state. Okay, so we've talked about the contrast between American constitutionalism and the progressives. How does this play out in American politics? And here I just want to give you some historical framework, if you will, some periodization to start introducing and looking forward to other conversations about American conservatism as well. And I want to talk about this in terms of four waves of liberalism, a concept really written about at length in some of his books by Charles Kessler. But I want to use his framework because it works very well in terms of our own context. Progressivism, as we talked about, begins at the end of the 19th century, into the early part of the 20th century. We can call that the first wave of progressivism. Remember, in American politics and in America, what is interesting about ideas is the moment they come into the political system. Abstract ideas don't automatically go in, and in many cases they actually don't stay. They come in through presidential elections, through movements, and through other things that introduce them into the American political system. The same is true with liberalism. Prior to this point, there really aren't these movements at all. Progressivism, self-understood, was the first movement, true movement, to change, fundamentally change the meaning of what America was all about in a very fundamental way. So we can define that as the first wave of progressivism. Here's where you're laying the groundwork, the intellectual beginnings, the framing of liberalism to come. The key figure here, you remember, is Woodrow Wilson. It's more of an abstract intellectual concept, although he is elected president, and they do achieve many things like a progressive income tax and the direct election of senators, the first regulations